evening, Joseph. I'm grateful for the invitation to present this lecture tonight. I want to thank the Grand Lodge of Freemasons in the state of New York. I want to thank the Robert Livingston Masonic Library for the invitation and for organizing this lecture tonight, as well as the 4th Manhattan District, which is sponsoring this lecture series. The idea of this lecture has come to me a few months ago when a good friend of mine and a brother, the worshipful Ivan Boluarte, was doing a lecture on architecture and agriculture in the pre-Columbian civilization. And he mentioned Maya calendar in his lecture, and this piqued my interest. And since then, I wanted to do some research and to see really what the evolution of calendars were, and to then share the results of my work with you. So without further ado, I'm going to stop the video. I'm going to share my screen. And from the beginning, and here we go. So, well, let's start with the date today. Today is Thursday, the 27th of January, the 27th day of January in the year 2022. But we might actually take this year 2022, for instance, for granted, or the date for granted, the 27th day of January 2022. But we need only to look at a few other calendars which exist and which are actually being used today to realize that it is only relative to where we are, and it is only relative, this date is only relative to the culture that we live in. For instance, the Hebrew calendar, which is in practice in throughout the Jewish world, according to the Hebrew calendar, it is the 25 Shabbat of the year 5782. Well, that is only until the end of the day, until the moon starts to rise, when actually it is no longer the 25 Shabbat, but it is the 26th day of the month of Shabbat, 5782. Or if we look in the Middle East, in the Muslim calendar, what we call the Hijri calendar, it is now Jumada 224 in the Anno Hejire, which is the year of the Hijra. It is Jumada 24 in the year 1443. Or even more, in the Chinese lunar calendar, we are still actually in 2021. We are not even in 2022. The year 2022 starts in a few days, in 4 days to be exact, with the event of the Lunar New Year. And according to the Chinese New Year, today is December 25th in the Qingqiu year, pardon my pronunciation, Qingqiu year 4719, which is the 12th month, 25th day of the 12th month of the year of the ox. Which is, as I said earlier, 4 days before the Lunar New Year. Well, it is true that our lives are bound up with a calendar. We use a calendar to plan our future, the annual round of work, the meetings, appointments, holidays, birthdays, and all of the other events in our life. We write them in our diaries so that we don't forget appointments and such. Our diaries also tell us the other events in the coming year: public holidays, religious festivals, weekends, the waxing and waning of the moon, and so on. The calendar helps us also to look back. The date of our birth is often a personal milestone in the calendar, such as for me today. And historians can look also in particular days: 1945, World War II, 1812, 1066. But they seem to be just numbers, but we know instinctively that they're more than that. Each event, actually, public, personal, great or small, has a day and a month and a year, which fixes it in a place, in time, as a marker in time. And when we speak of markers, and we try to look at history, we can realize that actually we have been throughout history and even prehistory, we've been defined by cycles of night and day, the cycles of the waxing and waning of the moon, the passage of the seasons, and also with the astronomy and the planets that revolved around us, the Earth, the Sun, and the Moon. And through the Sun and the Moon, for instance, we define the length of the day, the rise of the Sun, the setting of the Sun, but also the year, 365 days in the year, and with the moon we can define the length of the month. The issue is that neither the year nor the lunar month is an exact number of days, nor the year is an exact number of lunar months. And here's the rub. This is exactly the crux of the issue. So let's look back in time a little bit. Actually, before going back in time, let's try to go through some definitions to be able to proceed further in our journey through the calendars and through times. First of all, let's define the cycle of seasons, which is a year: spring, summer, autumn, winter. The tropical year, as it is defined, is exactly 365.2421 days long. That is to say, it is a little bit more than 365.25 days long. It's not exactly 365, and it is not exactly 365.25 days long. And actually, that number, 365.2421, is actually getting shorter by half of a second per century. So even that number is changing slowly, but it is changing year after year after year. Then the month itself, what we call the synodic month, which is the new moon and the first quarter and the full moon and the last quarter of the moon, is exactly 29.53 days long. So it is almost exactly between 29 days a month and 30 days in a month. That measure also is changing. It is getting longer by a little less than the 50th of a second per century. And then, so finally, if we try to square those two numbers, the month and the year, we realize that there's about 12.3682 lunar month in a tropical year. And you're going to see that everyone trying to define a calendar or write down a calendar in regular numbers, in a structure that can be replicated, in a structure that with which we can understand days and months and years, is going to be met with this challenge right from the beginning and constantly. The fact, as I said before, that neither the year nor the lunar month is an exact number of days, nor the year an exact numbers of lunar month. And so if we go back and look back, we can realize that as far back as the Paleolithic 30,000 years ago, 30,000 years before the Common Era, the earliest indications of the use of the symbolic notation to represent or visualize an astronomical cycle comes from the Upper Paleolithic period. At this time, in addition to striking cave art, engravings were made on small portable objects, such as stones or pieces of bone and antlers. Thousands of examples are known. A number of these are in the form of series of marks, and several were subjected to meticulous microscopic analysis by the American researcher Alexander Marshak. And he concluded that these marks were not a simple decoration, but carefully accumulated, often using different tools and techniques of a period of time. One famous example is part of an eagle's wing discovered in a cave in southern France at the Abri Blanchard in the Dordogne Valley in France. Dated to around 30,000 BCE, before the Common Era, it contains a series of notched marks in a serpentine pattern. Marshak proposed that these represent a tally of days. The assumption was that the earliest marks are those in the center of the pattern, and that the marks were accumulated around existing ones. In following the line outwards and back and forth, we discovered that there are about 15 marks in each sweep before the direction changes. The most prominent astronomical cycle is the phase cycle of the moon. In addition to being readily observable, it coincides with the female menstrual cycle. The moon's phase cycle is certainly recognized among modern hunter-gatherer groups, although not necessarily universally. The period of the lunar phase cycle, the synodic month, is between 29 and 30 days. So one interpretation of the Abri Blanchard bone is that it represents a tally in which the days of the waxing moon are marked off in one direction and those of the waning moon in the other. In other words, it forms a rudimentary lunar calendar maintained for about 2 months. Marshak suggested a similar lunar calendar interpretation for patterns on a number of other Upper Paleolithic portable artifacts. Now, of course, in spite of the lack of precision, the arithmetic counting skill implied by this small lunar calendar is obvious. The recognition that there are phases of the moon and seasons of the year can be counted. That should be counted because they are important and it is profound. A decade ago, what would be the oldest lunar calendar ever created also has been identified on the walls of the famous, on the walls of the famous prehistoric caves at Lascaux in the Dordogne region in France as well. The interpretation that symbolic paintings dating back 15,000 years show the moon going through its different phases comes from Dr. Michael Rappenglück of the University of Munich. The German researcher says groups of dots and squares squares painted among representations of bulls, antelope, and horses depicts the 29-day cycle of the Earth satellite, the moon. The animals were painted on the walls of the Chamber of the Bulls by Cro-Magnon man, one of our close relations 15,000 years ago. Below a stunning painting of a deer was a row of 13 dots ending in a square, as you can see in the upper left picture. Half the moon's monthly cycle, Dr. Rappenglück said. One dot for each day of the moon is in the sky. At the new moon, when it vanishes from the sky, we see an empty square, perhaps symbolically representing the absent moon. Further down, beneath a dapple brown horse with a dark mane, was another row of dots. This time, there were more of them, 29 of them to be exact. One for each day of the moon's 29-day cycle, when it runs through its phases in the sky. It was a rhythm of nature that was important to these people, said Rappenglück. These paintings are proof of knowledge of astronomy on the walls of the Lascaux caves. And earlier this year, Dr. Rappenglück identified also a series of constellations painted on the walls of a shaft of the main chamber in Lascaux also. The tiny pattern of the Pleiades stars cluster can also be seen hanging above the shoulder of a bull near the entrance of the main passageway. Even in Italy, a little bit closer to us, 10,000 years ago, another example of the lunar calendar was found in 2007 near the top of Monte Alto in the Alban Hills, south of Rome in Italy, in the form of a people, which was decorated over 10,000 years ago, dating back to the Upper Paleolithic. Short linear incisions or notches cut perpendicularly in a row along 3 of the people's edges. The 3 set comprised respectively 7, 9, 10, and 11 notches, spaced regularly and symmetrically along each edge to fill up all the available space from one end to the other. The overall number, 28 or 20, 27 or 28, and spatial distribution of the marks suggest that this complex system of incisions could be based on the lunar cycle. It seems that the notches were made over time using more than one kind of sharp cutting stone tool, as if they had been used for counting and calculating, or to store some kind of information over a period of time. The fact that the number of notches is precisely the same as the number of days in the lunar month, synodic or sidereal, makes this object unique among the supposed lunar. The artifacts is thus another one of the earliest known attempt in humankind's history to understand and to measure time, and provides new insights into the cognitive and mathematical capabilities of Homo sapiens in prehistoric times. As rudimentary as it is, this find from the Alban Hills may be considered also as an early evidence of the human scientific interest in the moon. Now, if we look not at the moon, but at the sun, and at the earliest solar observations and calendars, we have to go to Latin America and we have to go to Peru. Specifically in the 13 towers of Chanquillo. Chanquillo in Peru features 13 stone towers built between 2250 and 200 before the Common Era. And they function as a calendar by marking the rising and the setting arcs of the sun. The oldest solar observatory in the Americas has been actually awarded the UNESCO World Heritage status and dubbed a masterpiece in human creative genius. As you can see on the pictures, this 2,300-year-old archaeological ruins, Chanquillo, which lies in the desert valley in northern Peru, was one of the 13 global sites added to the UNESCO list last year. If you can look at the map that I just showed you now, in the upper left, you see actually the towers you had seen just now on the, you see the fortified temple. And you see on the picture on the right, the 13 towers of Chantico. If you look at the picture again, the map, you can see the fortress on the upper left. And in the bottom right, on the right half, you can see all those 13 towers. And those, a close-up view of the map, you can see that the researchers had actually looked at two viewing points, one on the eastern side of the 13 towers and the other one on the western side of the 13 towers. And basically, the 13 towers that align on the ridge are the best known feature of the ancient sites, which dates between 250 and 200 BC. And the towers functions as a calendar using the rising and setting arcs of the sun to mark not only the equinoxes and solstices, but even to define the precise time of year to within 1 or 2 days. The site also includes an imposing tribal-walled hilltop complex known as the Fortified Temple, set in the barren landscape of the Casma River Valley. Ivan Gezi, the Chanquillo program director, told in an interview last July that while it was truly overwhelmed by the recognition, he was not surprised that UNESCO found Chanquillo worthy of inclusion in the World Heritage List. He said, "It is the only observatory from the ancient world that we know of that is a complete annual solar calendar." And you can see here an example of the sunset through the sun setting through one of those 13 towers on the western part. As the legend explains, the 13 towers are viewed from A, the western observing points, and B, the revised eastern observing points. So let's try to define, before moving to a more recent examples of calendars, let's try to define for ourselves certain important concepts, namely seasons, solstices, and equinox. What are they? Well, let's talk about seasons first of all. Seasons are defined by any of the 4 divisions of the year according to consistent annual changes in the weather. We know that. The seasons, that is the winter, spring, summer, and autumn, are commonly regarded in the northern hemisphere as beginning respectively in the winter solstice, that is December 21 or 22. On the vernal spring, that is on the vernal equinox, which is the spring, March 20 or 21. On the summer solstice, which is June 20 or 22. And on the autumnal equinox, September 22 or 23. Those are the points in time: winter solstice, vernal equinox, summer solstice, and autumnal equinox. Those are the points in time in the year when the seasons starts, winter, spring, summer, and autumn. Now, it is understood also that at the equinoxes, the days and nights are equal in length. At the winter solstice, the day is the year's shortest, and at the summer solstice, it is the year's longest day. In the southern hemisphere, summer and winter are reversed, as are spring and fall. Now, with the solstice, let's try to define what a solstice is. The solstice is either one of the two moments in the year when the sun apparent path is the farthest north or south from the Earth equator. In the northern hemisphere, the summer solstice occurs on June 20 or 21, and the winter solstice occurs on December 20 or 21. Now, the situation is exactly the opposite in the southern hemisphere, where the seasons are reversed. In the winter solstice, the day is the year's shortest, and at the summer solstice, it is the year's longest. The term solstice is also used in reference to either one of the 2 points of the greatest deviation of the ecliptics, the sun's annual path from the celestial equator. Now, lastly, the last definition, the equinox. What do we mean with equinox? An equinox is either one of the 2 moments in the year when the sun is exactly above the equator and the day and nights are of equal length. Also, either of the 2 points in the sky where the ecliptic, that is the sun's pathway, and the celestial equator intersect. The vernal equinox, remember it is in the spring, marks the beginning of spring in the northern hemisphere. The vernal equinox occurs about March 21, when the sun moves north across the celestial equator. The autumnal equinox in the fall falls about September 23, as the sun crosses the celestial equator going south. And I mentioned those definitions of seasons and solstices and equinoxes because it is most likely that the people who had already defined either the solar calendar or the lunar calendar already in the Paleolithic, tens of thousands of years ago, had already understood what equinoxes were, what solstices were, and the course of the season. Now, let's look for ourselves in the first example of calendar that we will look at tonight, the Babylonian calendar. Before going straight into the Babylonian calendar and Babylon, let me try to stage the stage, to set the stage a little bit. To say that the first cities were formed between the Tigris and the Euphrates River that you see on the map, the Tigris to the north, the Euphrates to the south. And those rivers originated in the Taurus Mountains in southeastern Turkey, as you can see. The headwaters diverge and run south through Syria and Iraq, and several tributaries are added from Iran before flowing into the Persian Gulf. Okay, so we understand that now. Ur, which is a southern city that you can see right above the Sumerian region in the bottom of the map. Ur, which was founded around 3800 BC, before the Common Era, would once have been a coastal city. Changes to the landscape now place it more than 200 kilometers from the sea, but at one point, the Ur Empire would have stretched up through much of modern Iraq, incorporated a number of smaller cities. Now, clay tablets marked by the cuneiform writings indicate that before Ur incorporated them, those cities that is, those cities would have had their own calendars with their own names for the month of the year. Those months, by the way, were quite often named after the seasons. Another city, Umma, let me see if Umma is on the map. Oh, Umma, the city of Umma had months that translate such as harvests. Another name would be barley is at the K, and another name would be even first fruits, such as offerings. Each of the cities had a month called extra, quote unquote, that allowed them to reset the calendar in the same way as a leap year, which was already quite smart, I think. Now, King Shulgi, the conquest of King Shulgi, who ruled in the 21st century before the Common Era, unified all those calendars which were different in all those cities, and unified all those calendars into what is called the Yuma calendar, UMMA. And that calendar, Yuma calendar, formed the basis for what we know today as the Babylonian calendar. The human calendar, by the way, had itself 12 months and a 13th month every 4 years. Now, the Mesopotamian calendar was primarily a lunar calendar. And the month began with the first sighting of the young and waxing crescent moon just after the sunset in the western horizon. As a result, each month was either 29 or 30 days long, and the year was approximately, give or take, 334 years. I mean, yeah, 354 years, excuse me, which is exactly 12 lunar months. And you remember, as I said before, each lunar month is about 29 on 30, between 29 and 30 days, which is, that accounts for the about 10 days missing. Now, the ritual celebrations, however, were aligned with the seasons. And thus, the celebrations, so the ritual calendar, so to say, was mostly solar in nature, not lunar. Therefore, they had to add some month. They had some what we called intercalary month, which were added when necessary to keep the lunar calendar in agreement with the seasonal, with the seasons, with the seasonal schedule. Counting from the new moon, the Babylonians celebrated every 7th day as what was called a holy day, which was also called an evil day, meaning unsuitable for prohibited activities. On these days, officials were prohibited from various activities, and common maids were forbidden to, quote unquote, make a wish. And at least the 20th was known as the rest day. The 20th day of each month was called the rest day, quote unquote. On each one of them, offerings were made to a different god and goddess, apparently at nightfall to avoid the prohibitions. The lunation of 29 or 30, basically 30 days, basically contained a 3-day, contained 3 7-day weeks, and a final week of 8 or 9 days inclusive, breaking the continuous 7 days cycle. Now, Babylonian weeks would not have been unfamiliar to us. Each 7th day had a rest day, as I said, on which officials were prohibited from engaging in activities. As I said also, from a Babylonian calendar, the same activities could not be done on the 20th day of each month either. On each rest day, Babylonian made offerings to a different god. And perhaps the striking aspect of the Babylonian month would have been the length of the last week. Each week lasted 7 days, but during the lunar cycle, the month lasting 29 to 30 days, made it so that the last week of each month lasted 8 or 9 days. And so you can wonder why this Babylonian calendar was so important. Well, we should say that they needed a grip on time. They needed to understand and control the concept of time. And once they were able to keep time, they were able to use the seasons and many other things to their own advantage. The cycle of the moon made the month fairly consistent in length, and the rotation of the sun allowed for the days and the years to regular in length. What is the historical importance in this first calendar as we know it? One of the greatest accomplishments of the Babylonian calendar was that the creation of the 7-day week. This was such an accurate feature that it is still used today in the modern calendar. Babylonians were also the first to make a theory about leap years. The calendar occasionally features leap month, which is why leap days are still part of today's calendars. Now, let's talk about impact. How did it impact Mesopotamia at the time? Well, once the use of this calendar became popular, the seasons were consistent almost everywhere. And if I go back to the map that I had shown you before, the seasons becoming consistent everywhere, which means that the agricultural harvest time was the same almost everywhere. This improvement in agriculture led to mass production of crops and raw materials, which led to more trade. The trade of natural resources allowed for the economy in ancient Mesopotamia to be healthy and strong between civilizations. It allowed for the popular seasonal festivals. These festivals were very elaborate and typically took place during a specific month, which was possible only with the use of the Babylonian calendar. Now, how did it impact later civilizations? Well, this lunisolar calendar had many impact on calendars following it. This is why I wanted to expand so much on it. Both the Jewish and the Greek calendars used many ideas that originated in the Babylonian calendar. Indeed, one of the main ideas relates to Shabbat itself. Among other theories of Shabbat's origin, the Universal Jewish Encyclopedia advanced a theory that Shabbat originally arose from the lunar cycle, containing 4 weeks ending in Shabbat, plus 1 or 2 additional unreckoned days per month. Now, there's a term actually called Sabatu or Sabatu, S-A-B-A-T-T-U, there's the term that is used as a full moon merge with the Hebrew Shabbat, but it is monthly rather than weekly. It is regarded as a form of Sumerian Sabbat, S-A-B-A-T, which is the mid-rest, to rest in between, attested in Akkadian as Umnu Libi, the day of meat repose. Now, it has been alleged that Shabbat, was almost certainly derived from the Babylonian Shabbat, the festival of the full moon. But any trace of any such origins having been lost, the Hebrew ascribed it to biblical legend. Let's move from Babylon to Egypt, not that far. The Babylonian Empire lasted from 1896 BC to 939 BC, reaching its peak during the reign of King Hammurabi, who reigned from 1792 BC to 1750 BC. At the same time that Babylonians were looking forward to a lengthy last weekend of the month, the Egyptian Empire was growing in the West. Now, scholars dispute the existence of early Egyptian calendar based on the rise of Cyrus or the presence of a year lasting 360 days. But it's clear that as early as 3000 BC, 3000 before the Common Era, Egyptians were interested in the yearly cycle. What interested them most was the annual flooding of the Nile, of course. Each year, between May and August in the summer, according to the Gregorian calendar, the monsoon brings heavy rain to the Ethiopian highlands south of Egypt. The waters flow into the Nile, causing the river to flow its banks. But that flooding determined the size of the harvest. A system of dams and dikes drove the flood waters into fields and saturated the soil. The water that collected in the fields had to be sufficient to grow the crops through the dry season, and therefore a low flood meant a poor harvest. But the floods also determined the pattern of the year. Egyptians divided the calendar into 3 seasons. The flood season lasted from around June to September, and was when the Nile flooded and the waters inundated the fields. The second phase, the emergence, lasted from around October to January. Finally, the low water or harvest season took place between February and May. During the early dynasties of Egyptian history, the month within those seasons had numbers. First month of the flood, quote unquote, second month of the flood, quote unquote, and so on. In the Middle Kingdom, however, the months had picked up names which have largely survived through the New Kingdom and Greek calendars to the current Coptic calendar. Now, if we look at the calendars in Egypt according to the Nile, the 3 periods determined by the rise and fall of the Nile formed the year, and they occurred regularly. They were as crucial as migrating birds were to the hunter-gatherers in the Scottish Isle, yet no more predictable. While the rise and fall of the sun and the moon, or the turning of the stars, follow a definite pattern, the coming of the monsoon, like the flights of storks, depend on weather systems that vary from year to year. While the seasonal calendar allowed Egyptian farmers to predict when they should open their dams and plant their seeds, the seasonal calendar was decidedly less helpful at predicting and marking other events that took place throughout the year. By the time of the Old Kingdom, the period where the pyramids were built, Egypt had also instituted a civil calendar. Not a seasonal calendar, but now a civil calendar. The civil calendar is likely to have been based on the movement of Sirius, a star which reappeared in the sky at about the same time as the Nile would start to flood. If you look at this map of the skies, you can see in the bottom left, you can see in the middle Orion, the constellation of Orion, and below Orion, to the bottom left of Orion, you see Sirius, the constellation of Canis Major, with Sirius prominently inside of it. Now, it was actually, so the seasonal calendar was based on the monsoon and the rise and fall of the Nile, but actually the civil calendar was based on the movement of Cyrus. And so the civil year was made of 12 months, each one of 30 days, and an additional month of 5 days, creating a year of 365 days. The lack of leap years meant that the movements of the stars gradually fell out of sync with the names of the month. As the appearance of Cyrus fell back through the calendar, the Egyptians again had to correct that. And so they created what we called a Sothic cycle. Every 1,461 Egyptian civil year, Cyrus would return to its place in the calendar. So you had already basically with the Egyptian calendar, the number of days, 365 days, we are getting very close to the year that we know today, but there were no leap years. And this will be corrected later on. So now, after the Babylonian calendar, after the Egyptian calendar, you can see that it is moving toward a solar lunar or lunisolar calendar, and the number of days is now 365. And this will be actually more defined and detailed with the Roman calendar. So by the time of the establishment of the Roman Empire, we've had several millennia of experimentation completed with various calendrical systems and with multiple different ways of marking time. We had stone cycles and stone markings. We had the lunar calendars and combination of solar and lunar calendars. But still, we weren't getting it right. That the amount of time the Earth took to revolve around the sun couldn't be counted in whole days. When civilizations couldn't count an entire day, it meant that calendars in different places and times around the world would regularly fall out of sync with the seasons. If a calendar is out of sync with the seasons, it's out of sync with the stars and the movement of the moon. The earliest Roman calendars were little better than most. These calendars too started as lunar calendars, tracking the development of the moon over 29.5 days. With the early Roman days, the early Roman calendars, they only lost 10 or 11 days a year. At the same time, early Rome also had what we call a nundinal cycle derived from the Etruscan. I will explain nundinal, in a few minutes. The nundinal cycle was an 8-day week, ending with a market or a festival. Farmers would head to the city to buy and sell goods. Children had no classes on that day, and slave owners warned their property not to enjoy themselves too much. A year in the early Rome is believed to have been made up 38 such non-diurnal cycles, divided into 10 months of 30 or 31 days. How the Romans dealt with the remaining days is unclear. Some scholars have claimed that the Romans disregarded them, while others suggest that the early Romans practiced intercalation, which is inserting extra days into the calendar, intercalation, to fill up the gaps and make sure that the calendar didn't fall out of sync with the seasons. Again, the same conundrum. Now, the end of the Roman kingdom and the growth of the Roman Republic led to another revision of the calendrical system. Now, the Romans were influenced by Greek calendars, which divided the year into 12 lunar months, alternating between 29 and 30 days. The Romans, however, gave the 3rd, 5th, 7th, and 10th month of 31 days each. Each other month was 29 days, except February, which had 28 days and 29 in each leap year. So again, the Greeks at the time had divided the year into 12 months, and there were 12 lunar months, each one between 29 and 30 days. But the Romans, on the other hand, didn't decide to divide it this way evenly. They had the 3rd, 5th, 7th, and 10th month with 31 days, and every other month in between was 29 days. And February had 28 days and 29 each leap year. So each month too was carefully divided. The Romans called the first of the month calends, and this is where it becomes interesting for us. The origin of the word calendar comes from calend. Calend or calendae is the first day of the month. They call this day calendar because this is where they would start the month. And then from the first day of the month, from the calendae, they called the day before the middle of the month the Ides, Idus, I-D-U-S, or Ides. And the 8th day before the Ides, or 9 days counting inclusively, were called the Nons. And so again, the first day of the month was the calendae, which is where our term calendar comes from. And then in between, the day in the middle of the month, namely the 13th day, was called the Ides, Idus. Remember, you know the expression, beware the Ides of March, which is the 15th of March. And this is where it comes from. The middle of March is called the Ides. And from that middle of March, from that middle of the month, they went back 8 days, and they called that day Nones, N-O-E-S, Nonae, which is the 9th day before Idus. And so these moments were likely to reflect the calendar's lunar origins and mark the sighting of the crescent moon, the quarter moon, and the full moon. And we can begin to see and understand a bit of the information about the foundation of the calendar that we use today. In particular, we note the use of an intercalary month in February to keep the month aligned with the seasons. But the Roman calendar did have another interesting difference. After the establishment of the Roman Republic, control over the intercalation, which is to insert days of month into the existing calendar, the intercalation passed to the high priests. So the high priest in Rome became in control of this intercalation process. By adjusting the number of days in February, they were able to lengthen or shorten the term of office of the consuls, which they supported or they didn't support. And it was as though a political party could determine the length of a year and make a year longer when they were in office. In other words, the priests could gerrymander the calendar. And so this couldn't last long. And so in 48 BC, 48 before the Common Era, Julius Caesar, that we know, proposed a reform to the Roman calendar. The high priest's willingness to adjust the length of the year in accordance with the rule of their political allies, or to skip intercalation if it suited them, meant that the calendar drifted out of alignment with a year. So the Second Punic War against Carthage and the civil wars in particular meant that few people outside Rome knew the current dates. Between 63 BC and 46 BC, for instance, the calendar had only 5 intercalary months instead of 8. And none between 51 BC and 46 BC. Historians have called these years, 46 between 63 and 46 BC, the quote unquote, the years of confusion. Julius Caesar had spent time in Egypt. He knew what day it was and wanted a more conventional way of maintaining the calendar. So after returning from the African campaign in 46 BC, Caesar added 2 intercalary months between November and December, increasing the year by 67 days. The year had already been increased from 355 to 378 days. So in 46 BC, the calendar was now 445 days long. Imagine. Now, the reform then added 10 days to every year. 2 days were added to January, Sextilis, which is now August, and December. Another day was added to April, June, September, and November. February continued to be 28 days. The new calendar removed the previous intercalary month, replacing it with a new leap day placed before the calends of March, so before the first day of March, which is now in February. Romans continued to mark calend, Ides, and Notice, but the pattern of the calendar that would come to be used by much of the modern world has been now formed. The new calendar spread across the empire and also into neighboring states and client kingdoms, where calendars became 365 days with 1 leap day. Initially every 3 years, but eventually every 4 years. And so now you have it, 365 days, and you add 1 day you had 1 leap day every 4 years. And this is where also it becomes interesting for us. The names of the previous month remain mostly unchanged. January honored the god Janus to symbolize his new beginnings. These gods were interesting to study for many reasons. The god Janus had 1 head and 2 faces, and in honor of this god, 1 face could look forward to the future and 1 face look back into the previous year. Every month had deep reflections, thoughts, concerns, and deliberations to come to a consensus of opinion. The calendar was vastly serious to these people. So after January, named after Janus, February is likely to derive from the February festival. March was for the god Mars, god of war. The origins of April, May, and June are unclear, but may have been derived from the Etruscan god Apru, A-P-R-U, and May with the god Maya, Greek god Maya, M-A-I-A, and Juno, the god Juno as well, all three Greek gods. But also there's an alternative theory, which is that April comes from the Latin word aprire, which is to open. May and June are all Latin terms for the term senior and junior. The remaining months were named after the order in the calendar. So Quintilis was the 5th month. Sextilis, of course, was the 6th month. September, the 7th month. October, Octo, or 8, the 8th month. November, the 9th month, and December, the 10th month. 10 December. And so it's quite simple, quite logical, right? And later on, the Julian calendar, the Julian reform, pushed a month down the calendar so that December actually became the 12th month without changing its name. Quintilis, which was the 5th month, but also happened to be the birth month of Julius Caesar, became Julius, and it therefore became July. And Sextilis, which was the birth month of Emperor Augustus, became August or Augustus. Now, aside from Julius Caesar and Augustus, other emperors tried to rename month also. Caligula tried to call September Germanicus to honor his father. Nero also wanted April to be called Neronius. Domitian wanted October to become Domitianus, and those names didn't stick. And so this is where you have from the Roman era, the Roman calendar first, and then the Julian calendar, which sets the stage very much for its future edition, the Gregorian calendar. Now, the Julian calendar worked pretty well. 365 days, one leap day every 4 years. That was pretty good. But still, it wasn't wholly accurate. The calendar assumed that a year had precisely 365.25 days in a year. Remember what I said right in the beginning. The Romans assumed that in the Julian calendar, the year was precisely 365.25 days in a year, where actually that is not true. You know that the Earth takes 365.2422 days. So not 365.25, but 365.2422 to revolve around the sun. And that difference of 11 minutes every year was enough to push the calendar out of alignment with the equinoxes by about 3 days every 400 years. By the 9th century, Saint Bede and English Benedict monks had already noticed that the calendar had drifted by 3 days. 500 years later, Roger Bacon, figured that it was a good week or so out of alignment. And by 1300, Dante Alighieri talked of the need for a complete calendar reform. The drift of the calendar proved a problem for the church, actually. The celebration of Easter was determined by the date of the spring equinox, which the church had established fell on March 21. Again, the celebration of Easter was determined by the date of the spring equinox, which the church had established fell on March 21. Well, by the 16th century, the equinox fell about 10 days earlier than March 21. So they had a problem. In 1545, work on changing the calendar got underway. The Council of Trent authorized Pope Paul III to adjust the dates so that the spring equinox matched once again the equinox at the time of the First Council of Nicaea in 325. The Nicene Council also asked for a new way of keeping time to prevent Easter from drifting through the calendar again. And now comes Aloysius Livingston. Aloysius Livingston was Italian doctor and astronomer and mathematician. Whatever the faults of the calendar, works in the 16th century took an incredible amount of time. From 1545, it wasn't until 1577, so almost 25 years later, that the Reform Commission asked mathematicians for their contributions. The winning proposal came from Aloysius Livingston, an Italian doctor and astronomer. He suggested the leap year should first be cancelled for the next 40 years, allowing the equinox to catch back up with the calendar. Okay. He then suggested a new formula to stabilize the calendar. As he proposed, instead of adding again a day about every 4 years, if a leap year fell on the year divisible by 100, a day should only be added if a year were also divisible by 400. If the year 1600, one day, so therefore in the year 1600, one day would be added and would become a leap year, but not in 1700, 1800, or 1900. 2000 was a leap year, but 2001, 2100 will not be a leap year, and so on. The result would be the addition of a leap year on only 97 days out of every 400, instead of a leap year added every 100 days. These additions and subtractions ensure that the calendar was regularly brought back into alignment. The new calendar was adopted on Friday, October 15, 1582, and during the papacy of Gregory VIII. The previous day, according to the Julian calendar, was Thursday, October 4th. Spain accepted the new calendar immediately, followed by Spain, Portugal, France, Poland, Italy, the Catholic Low Countries, and Luxembourg. The Kingdom of Bohemia adopted the calendar 2 years later. Prussia accepted the calendar in 1610. Protestant countries were slower to adopt the calendar, concerned that it would bring their countries closer to Rome. Britain didn't close the Gregorian calendar until as late as 1752. Greece waited until 1923 to adopt the calendar, and Turkey did so in 1926. And so to say, the Gregorian calendar repaired the Julian calendar's error of one day every 128 years, replacing it with an error of one day every 3030 years. Now, Sir John Herschel, 19th century English mathematician, suggested increasing the year's accuracy by not making the year 4000 and its multiple a leap year, and he was ignored. Now, we need to say, now that we have arrived in the calendar that we use today, the Gregorian calendar, you still have the Julian calendar in use in some countries. And I conclude with that. The calendar is not only a way to mark time. The Gregorian calendar isn't a single calendar still in use. While everyone might be able to find the same date on the same calendar around the world, people still use other calendars. Even in Europe, the Gregorian calendar didn't reach everywhere. On the autonomous province of Mount Athos in Greece, the Julian calendar still reigns supreme. The province is made up of 20 Orthodox monasteries, and entry is forbidden on the island to women. Orthodox churches, if not Orthodox countries, remained with the Julian calendar. These countries even rejected a lunar calendar that would match the Gregorian calendar until the year 2800. The calendar was suggested at a synod, which is a congress in Constantinople in 1923. Apart from Estonian and Finnish Orthodox churches continue to celebrate their Christian festival according to the Julian calendar and not the Gregorian calendar. Other areas and regions have also stuck with their traditional calendar. Mr. Lobry, therefore, thank you for the time. I think I've been a little bit over time. I'm grateful for your forgiveness and for your understanding. And I will now conclude my presentations and